Getty EPAAccording Australian Treasurer Alexander Downer. Australia would seek out a bilateral UK deal. Australian High Commissioner Alexander Downer predicted that a bilateral trade deal between the UK and his nation could bring huge benefits for both countries, including slashing the cost of food, clothing and other consumer goods. But he warned that such an agreement is only possible if Theresa May's government regains full control of trade policy through a clean break with Brussels. He said, "We want to build back our trade with the UK. We could build substantially more trade if we were able to negotiate a free trade agreement with the UK." His remarks, in a BBC interview today, were being seen last night as another massive boost to the Prime Minister's efforts to forge new trading partnerships around the world after Brexit. Getty Alexander Downer believes Theresa May and ministers need to retain staunch control of trade policies. "We naturally don't want to see the EU and the UK introduce a whole lot of tariff barriers between them." Alexander Downer and his warnings about an EU customs union are certain to be seized upon by Brexit enthusiasts fighting attempts by hardline Remainers to keep the UK firmly tied to Brussels. Mr. Downer, speaking on the BBC Radio 4 Today programme, said Australia's 26 consecutive years of economic growth showed that reducing and removing tariffs on trade had a substantial and very positive impact. He said, "From Australia's point of view, here's what we would like to see coming out of the Brexit debate. Number one, we naturally don't want to see the EU and the UK introduce a whole lot of tariff barriers between them. There are none at the moment. We don't want to see that introduced. That would be damaging to the European and British economies, but damaging to the global economy. That's what we are worried about. Number two, we do want to trade with the UK, and we want to build back our trade with the UK. We could build substantially more trade if we were able to negotiate a free trade agreement with the UK. If you remain in the customs union, then you would have no control over an independent trade policy. In fact, you'd have no control over trade policy at all. Countries like Australia, China, Japan, the US and so on would not be able to conduct trade negotiations with the UK. We would only conduct trade negotiations with the EU. You wouldn't be relevant to that, because you wouldn't have a say in those negotiations. They would be exclusively conducted by the EU." Mr. Downer said Australia's experience since the mid-1980s showed the huge advantages of unilateral trade liberalization. He said, "The fact is that it does lead to some economic restructuring, some redirection of investment. But having said that, it contributes to economic reform, and you need a constant process of economic reform to achieve high rates of economic growth. It's worked for us. We've had 26 consecutive years of economic growth, partly because we've opened our market to the world. Unilateral reduction of tariffs had a substantial and very positive effect on your economy," said Mr. Downer, "and the policy was progressive because it reduced the price of imported food, clothing and footwear, on which low-income households spent a relatively large proportion of their income. Australia is already a larger export market for UK companies than India or Canada, while Britain is the second largest investor down under after the US." His words were echoed by the boss of oil giant BP today. Bob Dudley, an American who is one of the most senior figures in British business, said, "There are a lot of countries around the world that would like trade deals with Britain bilaterally down the road. I hear that a lot." Get a Bob Dudley said there were a number of countries looking for a bilateral trade deal with the UK. "Don't think British influence is diminished. BP works all over the world, and I see the importance of Britain in what we do and how they view BP." Official figures show that trade in goods and services was worth more than £13.1 billion during 2016. UK exports to Australia increased by 3% to £8.6 billion during that year. Australia invested in 108 projects in the UK last year, 11% more than the previous year, and creating more than 1,750 British jobs. Yet supporters of EPAAccording Australia trade deal are convinced commercial links between the two countries can soar after Brexit as long as Britain quits the EU customs Union, Tory MP Andrew Rosenthal, chairman of the Commons All-Party Group on Australia and New Zealand, said High Commissioner Downer is highly experienced and giving us the benefit of his perspective. Ministers from the Cabinet would do very well to listen to his advice. It is very positive. Britain leaving the EU is going to give us enormous opportunities, particularly with the Commonwealth and the English-speaking world. Mr. Rosenthal added being in a customs union with the EU would be absolutely the worst of all possible worlds for this country. It would mean we would be tied into EU bureaucracy and red tape, restricted by their economic interests and protectionist attitudes, while not being free to sign our own trade deals. Getty Andrew Rosenthal praised the comments of Mr. Downer last year. The UK and Australian governments agreed to set up a bilateral trade working group to scope out the groundwork for an ambitious and comprehensive free trade agreement. International Trade Secretary Liam Fox chaired a meeting of the working group in Sydney last November. A source at the Department for International Trade said the moment we are out of the EU we will be in a very strong position to sign a trade deal with Australia. The indications from both sides very encouraging.